right, guys, back here on the Establish the Pass podcast with my co-hosts, Dillon Reagan and Dillon. We're back here to discuss some fun things in the NFL offseason. As always, there's plenty going on, but we like to start looking ahead to the upcoming season. And there's a lot of new coaches in different spots in this upcoming season, and that is certainly the case here for 4 rookie head coaches who are going to be doing this thing for the first time. Then you've got 3 coaches who are in new spots, although they've been head coaches before. And so that sets up kind of a fun conversation here as we look at what the expectations could be for these guys who are in new spots coming up this season. As we said, 7 of them, and quite a few, Dillon, in pretty prominent spots in terms of expectations right away. And those expectations we know are to win and win now. And a couple of those coaches are going to be in that spot, it seems.
Yeah, it's 7 guys, like you mentioned, a little deeper than last year. I think we had 5. I will say that even with some really experienced coaches coming back here, at least when you look at the group from a season ago, the more successful actually were the trio that were brand new. You had D'Amico Ryans, obviously, what happened in Houston was amazing. I would say that Jonathan Gannon and Shane Steichen were fairly successful. On the flip side, Frank Reich did not last too long in Carolina. Here we are going to be talking about the Panthers in a second. Again, Sean Payton, not the best first campaign in Denver. We'll see how that pays off. But yeah, really deep group with guys that obviously have, at least with you look at the 3 that we'll get to at the end of the podcast with Morris, Harbaugh, and Quinn, guys that have a lot of experience in this league. Even if Harbaugh's mostly been in college, obviously the 4 years he was in San Francisco, to say they were successful is an understatement from a team that had been kind of in a wasteland for a few years to suddenly making NFC championship games in the Super Bowl. Obviously, Dan Quinn just came up short during his time with the Falcons. And yeah, Morris winning a Super Bowl recently with the Rams. So a really deep group there, and some exciting rookie coaches. But I'll just, as much as I want to, we expect to win, like you mentioned, and expectations are going to be high quick. And you can't really, we've seen it now. We've, the last few years, we've had coaches that get fired in year one. You think about Urban Meyer, Hackett, and then obviously last year with Reich. If it really goes downhill quick, some of these owners are not going to, and especially if they have the amount of money that David Tepper does, where he's willing to just eat a contract, he will do it. So we'll see how Dave Canales does as we lead this off. Yeah, definitely going to be probably one of the more tough situations, I'd say, to walk into in the league.
Yeah, it used to be, it felt like you're like, okay, a guy's guaranteed to at least get 2 years. Not the case anymore, where it's like you can get canned after year 1 if it's bad enough, and get canned before the end of year 1 if it's bad enough. And that does kind of bring us to this Dave Canales situation. He's going to be taking over for the Panthers, a team that, man, I mean, like we didn't have high expectations for it necessarily going into last season, but we did not think it would be as bad as it was. And now he's going to come over after being the offensive coordinator for the Bucs, and now he will see if he can turn this thing around. Although, as we said, they've made some additions roster wise in the offseason, and remember he was with the Seahawks for quite a while. He was a wide receivers coach, quarterback coach for several years there, also the passing game coordinator before he wound up going to that offensive coordinator role with the Bucs. So this is a guy that, is trying to sort of, I think, really help some things on the offensive side of the ball. And certainly, this is a team that, quite honestly, Dillon, feels like they need a revamp in pretty much almost every area, it seems. But that offense is definitely something that if he's going to have success in year 1, he's going to have to work some magic, because it just was not there last year. And we kind of talked about going into last season, they added a lot of parts. You didn't know if the parts were going to fit together, and just kind of didn't. But let's be honest too, that all starts with the quarterback, and there's a lot at stake for Bryce Young. He's going to get paid nicely, but there's a lot at stake in terms of how he plays under Dave Canales here, entering his second season.
Yeah, there's not going to be arguments necessarily that Bryce had more hype than, say, Caleb Williams. But to say that their situations going into the rookie years are completely different, I think is fair with the weapons that Caleb has, and just the opposite of what happened in Carolina. Obviously, on the flip side of that trade that led to Caleb ending up in Chicago, you end up trading away DJ Moore, and it was just a slow – when you're watching the team, not that these guys are actually slow, but compared to the rest of the league, it was a group at the receiving position that just could not – create separation consistently. Obviously, the offensive line had share problems, and you can pin some things on Bryce as well. It was a really brutal watch all season, and it didn't help that the number 2 pick looked so great really right off the bat. It was Stroud right after Young there in Houston. So, yeah, it was a situation where, and we've also seen early in his ownership tenure, David Tepper is maybe a little more involved than you'd like. It sounded there was kind of some vague comments from Reich after he was fired and even before about the decision to take Bryce, given that kind of Stroud fit more of the traditional QB that Reich's kind of gone with before, and tried to bring him when he was at least the head coach in Indianapolis, obviously with Carson Wentz as offense coordinator in Philly. But yeah, it's a team that Canales, like you mentioned, spent a lot of time in Seattle. He got to USC right at the right time, right when Pete Carroll was on his way out after a career that was mostly, I believe, just in high school. He's from around here, LA area, Carson, California. Got to USC that last year before Pete made the jump to Seattle with some of the things that were going on with the different sanctions and stuff against SC, and he's made it work for quite this long career now. And only 1 year as offense coordinator in Tampa, but I do think was pretty impressive. Obviously, the weapons that they had in Tampa were much different. We looked at that as a situation where this is a team that had a lot of, even if their guys are starting to get up there, some really talented receivers and skill position players, and but still to make it work with Baker and make it a QB friendly situation, I think is what they look at here. I know that this is a team that's looked at Ben Johnson and some other candidates before Dave Canales came in, but I think as much as the defense for the second half of the season, I thought wasn't they put together some decent games. I mean, if we forget quickly how many games they lost barely. I think of the Packers game where they did give up some points, but we're kind of in that one till the end. It's a defense that overall is not going to be overly impressive, but I think it has some players that you're like, all right, there's something of a foundation here. I think for Canales, the expectation that I would have if I was a Panthers fan is just to be at least not bottom of the barrel. I don't know how high up we're expecting, bringing in Deontay Johnson and obviously drafting Leggett there in the first round, when they traded back up into it. I don't know if that's exactly the group that is going to, along with Adam Thielen still, it's going to be overly impressive. I know they still have expectations for Jonathan Mingo. Didn't really do much as a rookie last year. They draft Jonathan Brooks. I think that will be a welcome addition in the backfield to kind of create some different things for Bryce. And maybe there will be re-emphasis on running the ball. I know they've had Austin Corbett for a second now and playing center now. If he can stay healthy, I think that's at least a decent foundational kind of piece in the middle of that offensive line. But I would say, their expectation is just to be, I'm not even saying top half of the league offense. That's probably being too optimistic, but even just being kind of in the mid 20s when we're looking at DVOA mid-season, rather than 30, 31, 32 like they consistently were last year would be at least my expectation now. I don't know what David Tepper's expecting. Maybe it's even less about those numbers and more so just Bryce looking like he belongs and we've seen some rookie QBs have really tough seasons and tough situations. You can't really compare Trevor Lawrence to Bryce, but they are situations where coaches were fired in year one. And obviously Trevor was able to bounce back. We'll see what Bryce can do, but that would kind of be what I'm looking for as a Panthers fan, is just some margin of, all right, we have something to build on with Bryce, and this offense is at least watchable most of the season.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say, as you said, that take Canales in a situation where he's going to have the lowest expectations in terms of what's expected of him probably right away, just because of how bad the Panthers were last season. But that could be a good thing, but also be a bad thing because, again, if you're in that same spot 15 games into the season, then how much progress has been made and all that. Like that's where we're kind of curious to see how that unfolds. But it does seem like they are probably in a position where he has, let's say, the least amount of pressure. But I mean, I can't imagine that they're expecting to go win a Super Bowl this year or make the playoffs even. No. So I think as long as that's realistic, and I think it is, he should be okay. Again, barring just a complete collapse somehow and them just not winning a game or something, that would be obviously grounds for termination. But we'll see. We go from that to now a situation in New England where Gerard Mayo has to follow Bill Belichick. Someone was always going to have to follow Bill Belichick.
Yeah.
And it was just a matter of who it was going to be. But it is Gerard Mayo, who, of course, has been there on the defensive side for a while. And, kind of seemed like from the start he was going to be the guy that was named the successor in that scenario. And, this is kind of, it's a little different. I mean, he's still following Bill Belichick, but it's a little bit different now because you're not following Bill Belichick where, let's say, he steps away after he wins his last Super Bowl. You're following Bill Belichick after, the Patriots sort of became unpatriot-like. They were not, the dynasty of old. They were nowhere near where they were when they were having all their success. And so I think that does take a little bit of that pressure off because, again, you're not exactly following, a 14-2 season where you get to the Super Bowl or win the championship or something. So I think that helps a little bit in this scenario, but there's still a lot at stake. I mean, we know, Robert Kraft, and this was always going to be one of the biggest decisions he made, who was going to be the person that was put in the spot. And so they feel pretty confident. You've seen all the things they've said, all good about what they expect for Gerard Mayo. He's got a new quarterback to work with. So it is kind of a full reset for the Patriots here. And not to say there won't be pressure, but I think it is kind of a better scenario for him, at least heading into his first season, than it would have been had the dynasty sort of continued and Belichick just decided to walk away.
Yeah, 100%. I don't think the pressure's nearly where, if we're looking at if there are questions about Belichick retiring, I know now that's not really the question. It's where is he going to be coaching next year? But if that had come up in, say, after Brady left or maybe after 2020, 2021 area, you might have been like, who's going to want to follow it up? Like you mentioned, now it's a little different story. Obviously, Mayo being there, playing, being a really part of the Belichick culture at a time when, it was transitioning a bit from the first part of the dynasty to the second half and the latter half where he as a player and then eventually as a coach. I think there's going to be carryover to an extent, even if I know a lot of the articles coming out about the changes in the vibes and just some of the rules and different things, that are maybe a little more maybe not necessarily modern, but maybe not the most Belichickian. It feels like they're trying to have somewhat of a culture shift, but I still think there's going to be things for if I'm a Patriots fan, my expectation is that defense doesn't take a significant step back. I know the offense is kind of going to be one of the things that will be followed really closely anytime you have a rookie quarterback, but also just given where that team kind of how stagnated they've gotten over the last few years. I think, they finished 29th in offensive DVOA a year ago. So not, even if they're a couple spots ahead of Carolina, they got some place to go up here. We'll see early on. We'll see if Drake May starts week one. I guess they still do have Jacoby Brissett there, got Jacoby Brissett back. You look at the overall that group. It's a receiver room that I don't think is terrible. I think taking a step forward on the offensive line, where it's a team that for so many years that was a really foundational piece of what the Patriots were. You think of, I think Dante Scarnecchia was there way before Belichick, even as working with the offensive lines, and his last year was the year that Brady left. So it's been a unit that still has had power, but not the same dominance that we saw. Especially think about some of the playoff games they had, the one against the Chargers, their last Super Bowl season in the divisional round, where they just completely wrecked that really talented group of players the Chargers had at the time. And it just hasn't been the same story for a few years. I know David Andrews still there. We'll see how Cole Strange can stay on the field. I think there's a lot of potential for him. So that's part of it. But I think my expectation, at least from Mayo and the side of the ball that he's coached on with the linebackers, but also obviously as a player, just keeping that defense in the top 10. And I think that's the path to success quicker than for this team, at least, than this offense suddenly becoming a top tier one in the league. The AFC is so tough. I know the odds are going to put the Patriots, and they have the Patriots down without a chance to win the division, without a chance to make the playoffs. If they somehow sneak in, and in my opinion, it will be because the defense maybe isn't even just ninth again, but steps up and gets even better. I think they have a ton of really talented players. You looked at how different it looked when Christian Gonzalez was off to an insane start as a rookie for them, but they have a group still with Barmore and Judon and Jonathan Jones, Duggar. I mean, this is a deep team that even with Jack Jones, I know there's some things, maybe if Belichick wasn't there, maybe he would have stayed, but he's looking okay with the Raiders at the moment, but they've been able to retool kind of with, Marcus Jones solid, Isaiah Bolden. It's a defense that I think, if at least carrying, like that wasn't necessarily, we're talking about the Belichick era at the end of it, and I think it's kind of changing for them. The defense stayed solid. It was still consistently good, even if there's not much it could do when the offense was as putrid as we saw for most of last season. So, they bring in Alex Van Pelt. I liked a lot of what the Browns did the last few years with their design. I think we saw they were able to make it work quite well with Joe Flacco there. So if you get bring Drake May in slowly and let him, I think he's more, we've talked about this. I thought he was pretty pro ready, more so than, and I think there are some people saying the same kind of thing now about him than it maybe the initial kind of murmurs coming out of draft interviews and that kind of stuff with league personnel would have said. We'll see if he starts immediately, but I do think there's something to be tapped in there. And I do think this offense can be solid in time, maybe not necessarily right away, but I still like some of the pieces. I'm curious to see how Polk does and how they use him. But for me, it's just the expectation I would have is defense stays a top 10 unit. And I think that would be a pretty successful, even if the culture overall is shifting, that's still those principles of what that's going to be remain intact. If they start falling off on defense quickly, I would be pretty disappointed given even at the end of that Belichick era, how solid that unit continued to play. Did you know learning actually makes a sound? It's true. Listen. That's the sound of you learning a new language with Babbel. There has been an increase in effort to scout for international talent to bring to the league. In no time, the sport we love will be loved by the entire world. Imagine flying out to games abroad and watching football with fans from other nationalities. So don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Spend the dollars on plane tickets instead and choose Babbel. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Babbel's convenient courses have helped me learn real-life conversation skills in a different language. It's easy to prep for my next trip abroad. Learning how to ask for directions, how to order food, and speak to merchants without having to consult language apps while I'm on vacation is priceless. Plus, they have speech recognition technology that helps improve your pronunciation and accent. If this sounds good to you, download Babbel. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/thepass. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/thepass, spelled BABBEL.com/thepass. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Well, and then there's another guy who's following, a legend in his own right, and that is Pete Carroll, of course, who no longer the head coach of the Seahawks. Instead, it's going to be Mike Macdonald, who comes over after being with the Ravens for a while. He various roles for the Ravens since 2014, I think. He went to Michigan there that 1 year as defensive coordinator in 2021. But other than that, has been with the Ravens pretty much his entire NFL coaching career. Came from Georgia. And so, now you've got him stepping into a spot where, the Seahawks different from the Patriots, but it is a franchise that won a Super Bowl not that long ago and, was kind of consistently seen as one of the powers in the NFC West and the NFC, but, just kind of did not become that over the past several years. They sort of it feels like they can never sort of regain that identity, when the Legion of Boom and all that. Now, it's hard to do. That's kind of a, maybe once in a decade or more type, group that came along the way they had. But still, they couldn't kind of refine that mojo, couldn't sort of stop the Niners and Rams and, kind of taking over at times there in their own division. But now with Mike Macdonald coming in, I mean, you've got someone who is certainly going to be expected to transform that defense, maybe back into one that, was very crucial in them, the Seahawks becoming a Super Bowl champion type team. And we'll see how quickly he can get that on track to see if, again, maybe this can be one of the quicker turnarounds. It's hard because you do know you're doing it not only in the NFC, but you're having to do it within that division where, let's be honest, the Niners aren't going anywhere. Rams, are right there. Usually Cardinals still a lot to be determined, but it's become a challenge just given the fact that the Rams have won a Super Bowl in recent years. Niners have been right there knocking on the door. And it's just kind of how do you break through now for Mike Macdonald and company in Seattle?
Yeah, it was a dark day as a Rams fan when Mike Macdonald was hired. I really wanted him to end up in Washington or somewhere else because he's the exact kind of made sense for how long when this team's going to change over to have a guy like him who with Baltimore's defense, how multiple they were, how creative he got. And he's a guy that just overall now, I believe he's the youngest coach in the league. Finally,
36.
McVay no longer has that nod, but his rise really was interesting reading more into him before this, hearing about kind of how he even got that job early on at Georgia. He was coaching in Georgia in high school and just took a team that was basically not doing anything and suddenly was like state champion kind of quality. And a lot of it had to do with not just his ability to, with X's and O's, but a guy that really understands how to coach, at that time, young men and now men, I think at this level. Between bouncing back with, like you mentioned, with Michigan and Baltimore, some really good situations he's found himself in. The Harbaughs tend to treat their own pretty well. There's a lot of recycling of coaches between the two brothers and just overall with these families for a long time. So no matter what happens in Seattle, I think Mike Macdonald's going to be set moving forward. But yeah, I think he's a perfect anecdote to what you're in a division with McVay and Shanahan. You're going to have to, I know that a lot of times we try to just fight fire with fire and go for the offensive guy and try to retool that side of the ball. But I think it had gotten to a point with Seattle where, and even the years of the Rams weren't the best, they still played pretty well against the Seahawks. There were some times where especially since McVay took over, they've kind of dominated that rivalry. And I think it's partially because of just some stagnation of the defense where they're able to expect certain things and take advantage of it all the way through last year. I do think for like you're saying, comes into one of the better situations here. But I think the Ryan Grubb, getting him as our offensive coordinator with what he did at Washington too, obviously playing up in that area is going to make fans excited about it. But just in general, really was impressed with kind of how that offense looked and how pro-esque it looked in Washington with some of the scheme things they did. So you go into a spot where, they had one of the most ridiculous receiving rooms in college football last year with the Huskies. And now you have a unit, which there are maybe at times we get mad at some plays that these guys don't, especially DK with blocking and doesn't always seem completely locked in. But when these guys are all cooking and you think of what the potential of Jackson Smith and Jigba, I mean, this is a group that, and Jake Bobo looked pretty solid. I'm always going to call out my Bruin there, but these guys, I think this offense has a chance still with Grubb to be pretty solid. And then it's just overall, I think Macdonald as a leader, what he's going to do with having this defense and getting Byron Murphy too in the first round, another pick where I'm like, really, Seattle is able to get this guy fit. I think exactly what they're going to want and be able to disrupt, especially against, you think about the Rams interior offensive line. It's going to be really tough, but I think to have someone that can at least compete with those guards in that center there with Avila moving over, it's going to be a lot of fun to watch these matchups. It's going to be very different, I think, than the last few years of these games. And yeah, there's still, like you said, in this division, it's going to be tough to rise up, but it's the NFC. Seattle was just barely missed the playoffs last year. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that this team with a little bit of fresh air and just a little bit of new things going on with an offense that finished last year 12th on DVOA. I think it's the defensive side last year 28th, where I guess that could be an expectation is let's take this unit to even closer to league average, even if you're not quite there. And if the offense stays around where it is, I don't think it's unreasonable to think Seattle could make the playoffs in an NFC field where I'd say there's maybe 9-10 teams compared to the AFC where it feels like the whole dang conference almost could get in. I think the Seahawks could find themselves in that mix quickly, and I think Mike Macdonald could end up being one of the hires of this round of new coaches.
Yeah, we'll see if he can work his magic on the defensive side in Seattle. And the Titans hired Brian Callahan to try to work his magic on the offensive side, specifically maybe at the quarterback position. Of course, coming from Cincinnati, where he was the Bengals offensive coordinator for 4 seasons, which of course did include a run to the Super Bowl in there. Before that, various stops with the Broncos, the Lions, Raiders, quarterback coach roles, quality control type roles as well with the Broncos. So someone who's been in the game for a while now, almost 15 years, I guess, at the NFL level, working in various roles. And now, after working with Joe Burrow in Cincinnati, going to maybe try to do the same with Will Levis in Tennessee. We saw some of the bright spots for Levis last season, had some really good games for the Titans. But we also know that this was kind of a franchise that maybe will never come out and say that they're kind of in revamp mode, rebuild mode, I guess, if you want to call it that way. But they made some big moves this offseason, of course, adding some offensive weapons to the mix. And so I'm curious really to see how Brian Callahan can sort of, as we always talk about, it's right. They go from Mike Vrabel, the defensive guy, to the offensive guy. It seems like that's always, anytime NFL teams make a coaching change, you always flip it. Like you go from the defensive to offensive, offensive, defensive, and vice versa. But I'm really curious to see what he can do with his Titans roster, because I don't feel like the Titans are that far away roster-wise. Because remember, this is a team, too, that's not that long ago was getting to an AFC title game, having a chance to be kind of a regular playoff team. They've got some older guys on the roster. And like I said, I mean, they brought in Tyler Boyd. They brought in Calvin Ridley. DeAndre Hopkins is still there. Tony Pollard added to the mix, go with Tajay Spears. You look at the defense, there are certainly some pieces there. And brought in L'Jarius Sneed. So I don't think this Titans team is, and maybe it's just me, as always, Dylan, being the Titans pessimist, but I'm starting to change my tune a little bit on them, because I don't think they're that far away. But really a lot of that's going to come down to what can Brian Callahan do with Will Levis, and can that be what they need to push them into being a team that can, as always, win what is usually an unpredictable AFC South, even though now with the, ascent of the Texans and where the Jags are, the Colts, like this AFC South is becoming a lot more intimidating by the day, it seems.
Yeah, this division, I know we've already talked about it a little bit, but it's suddenly become like it was always our division on this podcast when it was kind of the outcast one, and now it's suddenly one of the most exciting with the amount of all the young quarterbacks and the some of these coaches that are rising up. And now Callahan could join that group. I think one of the biggest additions of getting Brian Callahan is getting his dad to come coach the offensive lineman after his years with Cleveland. How he was able to really help develop them. Bill coming with his son to Tennessee for an offensive line that I think that is one of the units, this team that has kind of, in my opinion, held them back a little bit the last couple of years. It was a really good unit that kind of aged out over the last, I don't know how many years now, but the last couple at least, it kind of had some things to be desired. So I think getting Bill in there with there's a few offensive line coaches, and I started to stand by this, where it's like you get one of these guys that can really help develop players and maintain them. And when injuries happen, you're able to still maintain it. I think it's as important as anything for especially with a young quarterback like Will Levis, who gets hit as much as Will Levis does. And to be clear, sometimes his own doing. A guy that seeks out contact, it feels like at times where he could slide and he's like trying to jump over linebackers. We'll see how they can help with that. But I think with Brian and helping this offense be more consistent will be really important. But I think one of the most encouraging things about his Cincinnati tenure, obviously what he did with Burrow, but I think for me, it's more so how good that offense looked with Jake Browning. And I think how they kind of were able to change things up a lot more under center, a little, kind of QB friendly kind of things happening. Went away from and saw the success they're able to have going away. There's things that Burrow likes for a reason. He's very, obviously we know he's one of the top QBs in the league, but some stuff that maybe even when we talk about the Bengals later, they'll be able to look at that they did well with Browning and kind of see if Burrow will be a little more amenable to more under center stuff. But I think that's what was really encouraging thinking about him coming to work with Will. And also if Hopkins can continue to play as well as he did last year, this receiving room suddenly is not bad. I know it was kind of an issue last year, and now you have I still think Tyler Boyd has a lot to offer and is going to be kind of a veteran leader of that room along with Hopkins, but getting Calvin Ridley in there too, see what Burks' role is like. Still at times thought Kyle Phillips can be a useful player. So this is a group that I don't think is overly lacking. I think it's going to be a major change not seeing 22 back there taking the rock, or Derrick Henry going to the Ravens. So I mean, yes, they bring in Tony Pollard, but still that's going to be an adjustment where even with some of the offensive line woes, this team still finished in the, I think 14th in rush DVOA last year. And that's a credit to, I think after maybe a slow start last year, Derrick kind of turned it back on and looked like he found the fountain of youth to an extent. So I think a unit where, my expectation, again, for a lot of these, it's not asking miracle work to be done. It's asking things to just start heading in a more positive direction. The defense had kind of also stagnated a bit. So seeing how that group is able to kind of regroup here, bringing in T'Vondre Sweat, they have Sebastian Joseph Day. Obviously, we know what Harold Landry and Jeffrey Simmons can do. So it's a defensive line that has been kind of a tone setter for this group. I know they've some of the draft picks in the secondary haven't all panned out exactly, but still a group that I think could take a positive step. But I think from an offense perspective, obviously where Callahan's been coaching throughout his career and what he'll be doing mostly here in Tennessee, I think getting Will Levis, a situation where he's just not getting battered and bruised so much, and getting some of those, just making some easy reads and getting things open for him with this receiving group. Suddenly, even if Tennessee doesn't have the allure of Houston and what we expect from Stroud and this group and what we think the Jags can do to bounce back, and even what we saw when Anthony Richardson was healthy for the Colts, and what Shane Steichen overall did, it's a really fun division. I think Tennessee, to what you're saying, starting to turn around. Maybe it's the expectations were kind of out of maybe a little whack when they made the NFC or AFC title game back in the 2019-20 season. They made it, or the 1 seed the year the Bengals, Brian Callahan's Bengals beat the Titans in the divisional round on their way to the Super Bowl. So they've been right there, but I think that team in particular maybe overachieved to an extent with a defense that was really good and an offensive line that was still solid. There were still some questions overall about where the heights of what that team could be, and it ended up kind of showing up in that playoff game to an extent with Tannehill. But I think I know that maybe, again, with the same thing with this team overall reflected with Will Levis, doesn't have the hype of the other 3 quarterbacks in this division, but he was a lot of fun to watch. And there were some games where he was cooking. And I think if you can cut out some of the turnover worthy plays and some of the things that maybe at least with the made you kind of look away where he's taking hits he doesn't need to, I think suddenly this team, even if they're not, I'm not going to probably predict them to make the playoffs, but thinking they're going to be closer to 500 than 6-11 for the 3rd straight year, I think is not unreasonable with what Callahan might be able to do there.
All right, so those are the new guys who have not been head coaches before, and we talked about kind of the challenges maybe for some of them in these different spots. Now, these 3 guys, we'll just kind of group together, and we can take this wherever it goes, but Raheem Morris, Jim Harbaugh, and Dan Quinn, of course, they've all been head coaches before. Morris, the new head coach of the Falcons, was the Bucs head coach for several years, then was the Falcons interim coach in 2020. So he returns to Atlanta after seemingly everyone thought Bill Belichick was going to be the coach there. That didn't happen. Jim Harbaugh going to the Chargers seemed like one of the biggest locks out there, just kind of when the coaching carousel started. Of course, he's coming off a national championship at Michigan, but was the Niners head coach for several years, and as we know, had a lot of success in doing that. And then Dan Quinn, as of late, was the defensive mind for the Cowboys, which, was one of the more dominant defenses in the league over the past several seasons at times. Now he goes in the division to Washington. He was the Falcons head coach for several years before that. So, Dylan, as we look at these 3 guys, I'd say most of the attention is going to be on Harbaugh making his return to the NFL. And, like we said, coming off a national championship at Michigan and what he does with Justin Herbert and company there in Los Angeles. But, also some intrigue, I think, around the second chances, I guess you could call it, for both Raheem Morris and Dan Quinn, who had their worlds kind of converge in Atlanta, and Morris finds his way back there. And now Quinn heads to Washington to see if he can get the Commanders heading in the right direction in what has, as always, become one of the tougher divisions there in the NFC East.
Yeah, it's an interesting group of really guys, again, that have been prominent faces of this league at different times over the last decade plus. Like you mentioned, though, Harbaugh, obviously one of the faces of college football, finally capping off with that national title. A guy that, he'll be the one that's going to draw the most attention for a good reason. You look at even going back to Stanford and University of San Diego before that at a lower level of college football. I mean, he's always kind of come into places and everything kind of shifts. And I think the Chargers looked at what happened, not just with Staley, but the whole kind of operation. And it maybe finally Spanos got a little bit of a fire under his belly where he felt like they had just overall the organization was being questioned. So finally spending a bit, not just on Harbaugh, but some other members of the organization and the medical side and just everything, where he's kind of like, I got to put some money into this and make this a legit thing. And swinging for Harbaugh is a big one. And the fact he's able to land him and was willing to shell out the money that he hasn't in the past given to coaching candidates, I do think says something about it. It all starts with Justin Herbert, as we know. It's going to be interesting with, they have Keenan Allen and Mike Williams going out. They bring in Joe Alton, are really not surprisingly trying to start up front as Harbaugh would tend to do. So I think for the Chargers, this is a team that has had expectations and hasn't really worked out. They bring in Jesse Mentor again from Michigan as the defensive coordinator there. With the Chargers, I still some things on that side of the ball that I think will need work, but I think I don't want to overestimate what the impact of just their presence is going to do. But I do think it really will see a different situation here. Herbert already seems pretty fired up for the season. They bring in the Baltimore backs with Gus Edwards and Dobbins. Kind of hilarious to look at this group, but I think expectations for them are going to be immediately a playoff team. That might be a little bit too much, but given what you said, a tone when you take a Niner team that had been like winning 5-6 games every year, suddenly make the NFC title game 3 straight years immediately in a Super Bowl. This is something that, and what he did at Michigan too, a little different in the NFL, but you have a guy like Herbert that most people consider as a top 5, top-ish in that range quarterback. As a group of skill position players that I think, maybe isn't the most perfect group, but we'll see what Lab McConkey can do. Kind of, I imagine he's going to be doing a lot of what Keenan used to do in the slot. See what Quentin Johnson seems pretty determined to kind of turn around what was a rookie season that wasn't the best. So I think expectations, are probably to be a kind of a playoff team now. When I look at the other two situations, I'd say Washington first. Man, I don't think Dan Quinn's a bad choice by any means. I did have some concerns about how you look at it as a team that just was not able to adjust as a defense at times, and I think that was especially present when they played the Packers. It was a team that dominated 11 personnel, was built to beat 11 personnel, and then when they faced teams that played 12 or 21, could not be or not physical enough. And in the Charger or the Packers playoff game in particular, where they're usually 2 tight end sets constantly and just scheming up wide open guys, it happened just a bit too much where I'm concerned about that. But my bigger concern might be about the Cliff Kingsbury hire. I was not, I try to be nice, or I'm not trying to be like too brash whenever we are criticizing different teams or coaches and different things. But the Cardinals offense, it was another team that I wanted him to stay the Cardinals head coach as long as possible, because the Rams, man, they were able to do work against them and rarely ever had much trouble, even when Kyler and Cliff had some solid runs. Think about the first half of that 2021 season before they fell out of favor and then lost in the first round of the Rams in the playoffs. They had some things cooking, but that I don't know. It was a pretty it lacked creativity. And you looked even at USC's offense last year, man, they have Caleb Williams, and it's hard for, you look at some of the film, guys that watch a lot more film than I do on college football on Twitter and the write for different outlets. And they're like, it was just maddening at times to watch this offensive line and just overall some of the designs of what's happening. And so I know they tried to go after Ben Johnson. They tried to go after Mike McDonald, struck out on those guys. I don't know if there's not another coordinator I would have thought could have been a fit in this spot here. And we'll see. Maybe it'll all work out. I do have optimism for Jaden Daniels overall. I think it's an offensive line that still needs some work, but a skill position player group, and you set the tone with the Terry McLaurin, but I think a pretty solid group of skill players. I think Austin Eckler will be interesting to see what he can do. And I think Jaden can create a lot, obviously. And alleviate some of the pressure by being able to stay alive behind the line of scrimmage and make throws on the run. But it's still that one's more of a question for me. I don't know where my expectation. I don't know if I have as high expectations for the offense because of the Cliff hire, and maybe I'm being too hard on this, and not that he can't adapt and grow as a play caller, but that one's I'm a little skeptical of. Whereas the Falcons, they're just taking the whole Rams group with Raheem Morris and Zach Robinson and Jimmy Lake all coming over. I think a team that expectation for them is to win the division. I mean, they're the odds-on favorite by like a decent amount over the Saints, and then the Panthers and Bucks. Even the Bucks I'm surprised the Bucks aren't higher, honestly, when I look at them. But I would, if I had to pick right today, I might be still picking Tampa. But it is a situation. Obviously the Penix pick made a lot of headlines, and we talked about it after the draft, but we're over a month away from that now. And I think it's a talented roster, left a lot to be desired with some of the things they were doing last year. I think excited to see what Zach Robinson gets to do as getting to be a play caller now after serving under McVay on a lot of staff. So I think that's maybe out of these teams, expectations for new coaches are always going to be all over the place. But I think between Harbaugh and Morris, these are guys that are going to be expected to have quick results, maybe more so than the rest of the group, at least from my opinion. But I think the Falcons are decently set up because it was a defense that wasn't bad by any means last year. I'm trying to really quickly look up where they ultimately ranked in DVOA. I think they were in the top half of the league, but I could be mistaken. But still a group that I think at times struggled, especially defending the run. But we'll see if I thought they made some good additions on the back half, and overall, I still think that it's a division that, unlike the AFC South, the NFC South is pretty wide open for the taking. So maybe those are too high expectations to have for Morris in year one. But I think was really happy for him, obviously, with what he did with the Rams. Thought he was going to get a head coaching job after they won the Super Bowl. But here he is now getting another shot with the Falcons after, serving with Dan Quinn, being the interim coach when he was fired. And overall, I think a guy that maybe doesn't get as much credit as he deserves for the performance in the second half of that Super Bowl by the Rams. Just overall, the evolution of that defense when they've lost so many of those big name players minus Aaron Donald. And obviously now we'll see how that goes with the Rams without Aaron. But still a lot of prominent players over the last two seasons that left, and they still last year were able to be fairly solid. So I'm curious to see what he'll do on that side. But I overall think this is still a roster with a lot of talent that maybe just needs to be tapped into a bit more. Maybe this coaching staff is the group to do it. We'll see if they can live up to those expectations, or maybe the Bucs will still continue to be just low key the leader of this division once again. Yeah,
lots of expectations. I think when you're the coach of the Falcons, and we talked about the Falcons, kind of in the draft and adding Penix and all that, and so I'm curious to see what happens. That seems like that may be becoming like the new AFC South at times, where you just don't know what to expect from the 100%. NFC South. And so we maybe just be switching conferences there for that. We'll see what happens with Raheem Morris, Jim Harbaugh, Dan Quinn, all the other guys we said in new spots, the rookie head coaches there in Carolina, New England, Seattle, and Tennessee. But there you go. There's some thoughts on these new coaches in the NFL heading into the 2024 season. Of course, Dylan, lots of coverage over Clutch Points to get everybody ready for training camp, for preseason, the regular season. It'll all be here before you know it. So let everybody know where they can find all that. Yeah, we got the mini camps going this week, and I think another like 20 something next week. I think about 10. So yeah, we got coverage of tons of interviews, tons of fun stuff to go around. Even this part of the off season that we think is one of the deader sections. There's a lot happening at least the next couple of weeks. So you can go to Clutch Points, the NFL section. Got that all covered. The Clutch Points app and our NFL section there. And yeah, we'll be back pretty soon to talk more about some of these off-season. I always enjoy these off-season kind of discussions where we go through looking at the new coaches, the most improved teams, all the different things. We'll get to the new quarterback situations. I'm sure we'll talk about pretty soon. But yeah, it's can't, like you were mentioning before the podcast, ready for football season. It feels like, all right, now we've had enough time off. We're getting to the end of the college baseball World Series coming up. We got the
Stanley Cup Finals and the NBA Finals. We're getting to that part where pretty soon it's just going to be baseball. I love baseball. Obviously, we're big Dodgers and Braves guys here, but ready for some training camp very soon. It should be a fun season. Already looking forward to it.
Yep, should be a lot of fun. And like you said, check out everything over at Clutch Points. And yeah, it's going to be another exciting season, I think, in the NFL. And as always, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Any podcast app you use, search for Establish the Pass. And thanks as always for listening to the podcast. We'll talk to you next time on the Establish the Pass podcast.